Just a quick bit, we are RDI Associates. We've been working on this project with Rosanna from Reheat. Rosanna's joining us this evening to present on the sort of technical details of this project, particularly the GIS applications that we're using. So I'm a chartered forester, my colleague Martin's a chartered forester, yeah, we've been working on this project now for I think the last 4 or 5 months, I think it is. And it's part of a series of funded national pilot projects about bringing woodlands into management and looking at innovative ideas to stimulate woodland management. Martin will go into a little bit more detail about the drivers behind that, why the Forestry Commission are so keen to see woods brought into management. Our particular project, we're focusing on using GIS, geographical information systems, of which Rosanna will talk about in more detail, to effectively try and target areas of unmanaged and undermanaged woodlands. In addition to the sort of the technical bit, we are obviously doing a series of webinars, and we'll be hopefully identifying clusters of unmanaged woodlands and providing more focused and tailored support to woodland owners as well. And more on that in Martin's presentation.
All right, shall I take over now, Will?
Yeah, just letting in a couple of others. A couple of others have just joined us. Thanks for joining us. So yeah, I'm going to hand over to Martin to kick the presentation off. I'll keep letting people in as they join. Just a quick one. Just seeing the chat come up from Mark. Yes, Mark, we were actually just talking about making all the presentations available and the best way to do it. We will make these presentations available. We're just discussing whether or not a shared folder or Dropbox is going to be the best option, but we will provide a follow-up email with details on that. Okay, over to Martin.
Great. Okay, thanks very much, Will. Thank you for that. Hopefully you can see the slides all right. They do seem to be a bit slow moving. Just let me know if you can't see the slides, and I'll try and speed it up a bit. So, okay, so just what we're going to be talking to you this evening, the background to the project, we always mentioned a little bit about, but I'm just going to sort of expand on that. What we aim to achieve with the actual project itself and the sort of outputs that are coming from it. The process of how we actually identify unmanaged woodlands. I'll just very briefly introduce that, and then my colleague Rosanna will talk in more detail about the technical side of it. And then back to me to what we can do to further support owners of unmanaged woodland. So just a little bit of background. Most of our woodlands, as you probably know, have been managed in the past to provide timber and fuel for many hundreds of years, if not thousands. And really it's only in the last sort of 100 years or so since the end of the First World War that a lot of woodlands have become unmanaged. And it is this management that has shaped and maintained the habitats which we enjoy and wider society enjoy and value. And not just the habitats, but they value in the landscape and for recreation and all those sorts of things which are becoming more important as we go ahead and have become particularly important over the last couple of years or so. And really in the British Isles, there's no such thing as a natural woodland as such. All of them, however remote, have been shaped to some extent by society and management in the past. And as humans have removed the sort of higher predators and the bigger animals that roamed around our woodlands originally and managed them in a way, and we then took over the management of them through coppicing for timber and fuel. But as I say, it's really only the last 100 years so that's stopped. So currently where we are at the moment is about 41% of England's woodlands are not actively managed. And as we summarised in the first webinar in the series, this can have quite a negative impact on their biodiversity. It means that woodlands become sort of quite uniform in their age structures. They become quite dark. There isn't the lighting they're required for a lot of ground flora and the wildlife that goes along with that. So they tend to become quite of low value for a range of plants and animals. So for those reasons, it's Forestry Commission objective to measure and increase the proportion of woodlands into management, and it is part one of what they call their key performance indicators, a KPI, which those of you involved in businesses, you might recognise that term. One of the Forestry Commission's KPIs to actually measure and increase the proportion of woodlands into management. And this is just an extract from the Forestry Commission's annual report and accounts from 2020 to 21. It looks like a complicated graph, but it isn't really. It just shows the proportion of woodland that's in management. It sort of starts off in 2008, comes up to pretty much up to date, end of March 21. And you'll see that since then, in the last 12, 13 years, we've increased from about 48% in management up to about 59%. Now, both Will and I have been involved in trying to bring woodlands into management for the last 20, 25 years or so. But I think we'd probably be the first to admit that a lot of the reasons why woodlands have been brought into management in the last 10 years or so is down to things like oil prices and timber prices that relate to that. The hard winters of 2010, 2011 saw a really big increase in the cost of heating oil. Firewood, as a result, became more expensive, and it just made it more realistic for people to manage their woodlands. So that produced quite a big increase, and then also supported by grants and advice. And so it means that for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been ticking along at about 58, 59% of woodland managed. But there hasn't really been a significant increase in that in the last few years or so. So it does seem we're sort of bumping along that sort of proportion. The lower graph there just shows the proportion of woodland that's managed in England if one was to exclude that managed by Forestry England, the state's own woodlands, if you like. So just a bit more about the background to the project. As part of the government's Nature for Climate Fund, which you've probably heard about over the last few years, the Forestry Commission provide woods into management Forestry Innovation Funds, as they're called. The variety of innovation funds that relate to sort of woodland management, timber production, and these sorts of things. And as it says there, the aim is to stimulate the development and testing of new ideas that can help improve the ecological condition of woodlands. Hence why a lot of the focus of our talks the last few weeks has been around sort of biodiversity values and these sorts of things. The resilience to climate change, we've had one of our talks about that. And therefore, via this increased demand for wood, it will produce increased levels of woodland management. So what we actually aim to achieve in the project is through the GIS development and application, a new data set for Yorkshire and the North East, and a guidance document so people elsewhere in the country will be able to repeat the exercise. So it isn't something which is just happening in Yorkshire and the North East, and once it's done, it's done. It will be there will be information available to others to actually repeat it, suitably amended for their own situation, because what might be important in Yorkshire and the North East won't necessarily be important in the South East or Wales or Scotland or whatever. So and Rosanna's going to talk a bit more about the process for that in a minute. And then landowner engagement, we're hoping to support 40 woodland owners with initial online assessment of options and guidance with woodland management planning. And the reason why, what you might say, what's innovative about that, but the reason why that is we're trying to do this online, as much of it online as possible, for reasons which have become very apparent over the last couple of years or so, but also the fact that it just saves time, saves travel cost, opens it up to different people who might not have been able to access advice in the past. And then delivering 10 webinars as part of that. And also undertaking this United Kingdom Forest Standard Evaluator tool trial. We've mentioned that in the past, but this is a new tool which will enable woodland owners to evaluate their woodland against the UKFS. And the idea is that we will again support those same 40 woodland owners to use the evaluator. The idea being is that you undertake it at the beginning of the process, and when you've been through that sort of initial online assessment of options and guidance, and then assess yourself again, see how you've moved forward. So I'm just going to very briefly mention how we identify and manage woodlands and then pass over to Rosanna. So what we're doing is using geographic information systems, or GIS as you refer to it, to develop a new data set, which will indicate which woodlands are currently unmanaged, but which have the greatest potential to be managed whilst providing multiple benefits. We've been using this term of sort of manageability. I don't think it's really a word as such, but I think it does sum up most of what we're trying to achieve. And we're assessing that potential by identifying and assessing criteria for each woodland that would indicate A, how viable management is likely to be, and B, the benefits of managing that woodland. So those two sort of a central range of criteria, and then coming up with the ones which we think are most manageable. So I'm going to now stop sharing my screen and hand over to Rosanna. There we go.
Can you see that, Martin?
Yeah, that's fine.
Fantastic. So I'm Rosanna Curtis. I work with Reheat. I've been working with Martin and Will over the last, I think, 6 months or so on this project. We found it quite an interesting process, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that this evening. But the ultimate aim, as Martin said, was to use GIS to identify currently unmanaged woodlands with the lowest barriers to management, with the idea to then engage with them and discuss kind of whys and why they could bring their and should bring their woodlands into management. So we've been using a methodology called multi-criteria decision analysis, which means effectively a spatially explicit analysis of different criteria to help decision making. It can be applied to a variety of things. It's often used in the planning and energy resourcing sectors. And so we're trying to bring it here to woodland management. Why is it a good methodology? It can inform decision makers and provide objective reasoning, as well as balancing multiple, often conflicting criteria. It's a nice sounding board. It doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, just because our analysis has shown that it's potentially an area of woodland that has a potentially higher barriers, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be brought into management, but it just provides a sounding board as to decisions around target areas for policies and funding. So the process really takes a range of sites, so a range of different alternatives on the right-hand side there, and it evaluates it against a load of factors and constraints. Constraints being kind of a yes or no criteria, and factors being something where, you know, if it's closer to a road, it would be better, but if it's further, it's less appropriate, for example, to be brought into management. And then the goal is to then identify those areas of unmanaged woodland with the lowest barriers. So we'll talk about the alternative first. This map comes from the Forestry Commission's Managed Woodland dataset, which is available on the DEFRA Data Services platform, if anyone wanted to have a quick look at it. And the green here is showing the woodlands that are currently managed. So you can see Kilda Forest on the left-hand side, a large Forestry Commission forest, which is managed, but they can then see the red parcels, which are areas of woodland that are currently unmanaged. And this is unmanaged according to the Forestry Commission's definition, which if it is managed, it generally will have a grant application associated with it, or a felling license application, or be managed by the Forestry Commission themselves, or any other kind of countryside stewardship woodland creation agreement, or kind of a Forestry Commission recognised agreement or grant, effectively. And so what we're doing here is we're looking at the red areas, we're discarding the green areas, and we're assuming that, you know, they are being managed because of their grant applications, their licenses, et cetera, and we're focusing on these little red dots. And then we're analysing them against different factors and different constraints. And so part of this process has been to identify barriers to management. And this was our initial list. It was quite a long list. The top one there is the size of the unmanaged woodland and its proximity to other managed woodlands. You've got slope constraints, roads, markets, so your access to sawmills and firewood producers, designations, so your SSSIs, proximity to watercourses, the woodland size, ownership type. And as we went through the beginning of our project, we kind of discussed these different criteria and evaluated them and narrowed them down a bit to see which ones were probably most applicable. And so we identified that there's kind of two areas. You've got the barriers, but also the benefits of bringing woodlands into management. And so the scope of the analysis slightly changed to the fact that we were also now considering both barriers, but also incentives to manage woodlands. So we were identifying woodlands that both had low barriers, but also had the biggest incentives for different reasons. And so your barriers might be the woodland size. So if it's a smaller woodland, there might be less incentive to manage it than if it was a bigger woodland. Your slope, your access with regards to roads, your markets, your designations, and any potential funding or grant aid that you might get. And then we've also identified the benefits, which are multiple there. You've got biodiversity reasons, historic environment, landscape, proximity to people, and also watercourses as well for improving water quality. And so within each of these sectors, effectively, so you've got your markets, your designations, we then identified multiple GIS data sets, which we could use to undertake our spatial analysis. And what that means effectively is that we could get, for example, the maps of the roads across the UK, and they'll have their spatially explicit data behind them. And then we can identify woodlands that are close to, for example, roads or further away from roads. So those that are closer to roads will be more suitable or will have lower barriers to bringing woodlands into management with regards to access than those that were further away. And we then went through a really interesting process of trying to decide which ones were more important. So this analysis is quite clever in the fact that we can assign different weightings to different factors. And so we had a discussion amongst the team with Martin and Will and our colleagues over in Silver as to which factors were the most important to consider when bringing woodlands into management. I don't know what your view is on it, but some people might think that the woodland size is more important than the access to the market, or perhaps that the opportunity or getting funding or grant aid was more important than access to the markets themselves. And so we compared each factor against each other factor in both the market side of the criteria, but also the benefit side of the criteria, so that there was no, just to keep things very clear, effectively keep it separate. And this was the result of our discussions. So on the market side, woodland size came out as being the most important factor to consider, whereas the slope was the least important factor to consider. And then on the benefit side, the opportunities for biodiversity appeared to be the most important when considering whether to bring woodlands into management or not. And so what we did here was we undertook spatial analysis of these different data sets. And the one on the left here is showing the market analysis, so proximity to sawmills, firewood producers, and any other markets. And it's quite, hopefully you can see this on the computer screen, but the lighter areas show that areas of land that are closer to markets, and the dark areas show those that are further away. So we did this for each of the different factors, and each kilometre square ends up with its own value. So if it's closer to 1, then it means that it's closer to the market, whereas its neighbouring kilometre square might be slightly further away, in which case have a lower value than the square next to it. And so we did this for each of them, and what you end up then is a load of layers, and each kilometre square had a score for each criteria, whether that was access or markets or slope, and it's multiplied together to end up with a final score for that cell. And we can then analyze that to see which are the areas of woodland with the lowest barriers, but also the best incentives. So this is a brief snapshot of the results on the left-hand side here. And you can see a pocket of woodland with green. It's more suitable than an area with red. And that's more suitable in terms of low barriers and high incentives. And you can see that generally, if it's bigger, it's more likely to be green. So the green pocket on the far left, hopefully you can see my mouse there, that's quite a large woodland. And this is reflective of the weight that we assigned it, and the fact that everyone thought that the size of the woodland was the most important. But it's interesting the fact that this little green pocket at the bottom there, there's quite small bits of woodland, smaller than, for example, these orange bits here. And that shows that there's different factors coming into play for these bits of woodland here. They might be closer to a road, they might have better designations in terms of funding, that might be closer to people, and therefore they might have better incentives for bringing woodlands into management for people. And so you can see that each pocket of unmanaged woodland has a slightly different score, and that takes into account all of the different criteria we've already talked about and the weighting that we assign them during the analysis. We can then overlay this data with other maps to help identify target areas. I've left this anonymous for now, but we can also carry out further spatial analysis to identify the clusters. So why is this method important? I think it identifies the easiest woodlands that can be brought into management, and that's not saying that, those in red, as we discussed right at the beginning, it's not saying that those shouldn't be brought into management. It's just showing that they have slightly more barriers than those in green. It identifies the most resource-efficient woodlands to be brought into management, and it identifies local issues potentially preventing management into woodlands, so access or proximity to markets. And we haven't gone into further analysis of this in the project, but there is absolutely scope to do that, to understand why certain areas potentially multiple different woodlands and different ownership types are having issues in bringing their woodlands into management. So it's a nice aid in discussion and identifying where there should be better funding potentially, or targeted information to help bring woodlands into management. So that's a bit of an overview of our project. Hopefully you found it interesting. I'm sure we can answer some more questions about it at the end. But the next step now is to continue the analysis and identify kind of clusters which could and should report into management. So I think I'm back to you now, Martin.
Okay. Thank you, Rosanna. So I'll just start sharing my screen again. Right, can you see that okay now? Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. Right, so just a couple more slides from me, and then we'll go on to questions then. And thank you for that, Rosanna. By the way, that was really great, and I think showed really well how what's at the core of the work we're doing. So, okay, so having identified those clusters, then our sort of next step, if you like, is to provide some targeted support to owners in those areas. And in terms of what we can do with that, we'll be undertaking, as I described earlier on, this online assessment of management options for their woodlands. So what that means is speaking to woodlands, to the woodland owners, and actually sort of using the various online tools that are available to assess individual woodland characteristics, their value, the barriers, these sorts of things, and see what the management options might be possible for them. And then some further guidance with the woodland management planning processes. You might have participated in the webinar earlier on around woodland management planning, and the one next week is also on the same sort of subject. So we'll be able to help further support with that. And then, as I said earlier on, also to support applicants in the use of the UKFS evaluator tool, which is a really important part of the process that we're engaging with here to actually assess how woodland owners are moving forward with their woodland management. So we can actually measure it to some extent. So it isn't always just a sort of gut feeling as such, but we can actually put some measurement to it. So. Right, so I just mentioned it just then about next week's webinar. So just a sort of brief advert for that before we go on to the questions. So next week, this time next week, Tuesday the 22nd of February, we'll be hearing from George Dennison at the Silver Foundation about something called the My Forest Woodland Manager. The My Forest is part of the suite of tools which Silver Foundation offer to woodland owners and woodland managers across the country. They're all sort of free to use online woodland management tools. I say free to use, there are some sort of paid for premium options, but the basic thing is free to use. The idea with the woodland management tool is that it allows woodland owners to map their woodlands using a variety of sources of information, store that information and prepare UKFS compliant management plans. And as George will describe next week, the idea being that you can essentially submit your management plan then for any grants that might be available, as well, of course, using it for your own use. So do please join us next week if you can. Erica will be sending out the invitation next week. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see if we've got any questions. Will, over to you. Do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks, Rosanna. That was great. I know, Rosanna, you spent an awful long time crunching the data to produce that that application, as it were. As far as I'm aware, it's a bit of a first for unmanaged woodlands. What's been done to that level and that extent of analysis and using, I suppose, that much data. God knows how much data storage you've gone through over the last couple of months, but I imagine it's quite a lot. There are some questions coming in, and there's a couple of interesting ones from Mark. Mark, I don't know if you want me to introduce your questions, or if you're happy to unmute and ask your questions yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm happy to ask them.
Thank you, Mark.
I have 3 or 4 actually. My first one is, how does our percentage of woodlands under management compare with other countries? So are we lousy, or are we good compared to others? The second one is, it looks a really interesting tool, and it's obviously being used here to look at existing woodlands. My thought was, could this same tool be used to identify potential new areas of woodland? I'm particularly interested from a Yorkshire Dales perspective. We're looking to increase the planting in the Dales. Could this sort of tool, in addition to the opportunity mapping which we're doing, could that work together to help identify areas for potential? Third question was the benefit to landowners. It'd be great if it could be quantified in pound notes. So are you able to say, if you were to take your unmanaged woodland to managed, the potential benefit to you is X pounds? And the bonus question is, in the criteria to determine if a woodland is under management, are we not using the presence or not of an existing management plan? Surely that's an indicator also of whether a woodland is under management. There you have it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. Martin, I'll hand over to you for question 1.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're going through those. Mark, thanks for those. Yeah, in terms of comparisons with other countries, it's difficult to say because not all countries collect those sort of statistics, and each country has a different version of what in management means. It's something actually we've debated quite a long time in this country, and just to give you an example, it probably sounds a silly example, but actually, if your management plan says you don't need to do anything, that still counts as being in management, because the conscious decision has been made to do nothing, if you like, whereas some other countries would sort of count that as doing nothing. So broadly speaking, we are below the EU national average. I think in the EU, there's about 60% of woodland is in some sort of sustainable management system. Now, we're about the same just in management per se, but not all of that will be in some sustainable certification. So we're probably below the EU average. What I would say is because we have so little woodland in this country, our management of it has tended to be quite intensive in the past. Up until 100 years ago, we were managing virtually all of our woodland. Whereas if you go to France, for example, where they've got 30% something woodland cover compared to our 11%, whatever it is, they have got vast areas of woodlands which are managed, but they've also got vast areas of woodlands which aren't managed because they're, perhaps in mountainous areas and they're much larger areas. So it's difficult to give a straight answer to that question, really, Mark, in that sense. But yeah, broadly speaking, we're below the average. I think in terms of the second question about new planting, yes, I mean, you mentioned their opportunity mapping, and that's something that's taking place, for new woodland in a variety of different guises in terms of, where it would have most uptake, most impact on carbon sequestration, for example, where it would have most effect on quality of lives, flooding, remediation, these sorts of things. And in many ways, that is the mirror image of what we've done with this project. So I suppose the difference with ours is obviously we're taking, existing woodland. So we are taking an identifiable bit of land, whereas all those other types of mapping tend to be much broader views. In Nidderdale, for example, there's been a recent exercise to look at opportunity mapping, and it doesn't tend to be done by field, for example, whereas we're doing woodland by woodland. So it's slightly different in that sense, but they are, broadly speaking, very similar approaches, just albeit that ours is at a greater level of detail. Your next question about benefit to landowners and quantifying it. Yeah, I must admit, I've not really thought about that. I think at the moment we wouldn't be able to do that until we actually got into the woodland to see what was in there, really, because it does ultimately come down to, the quantity of timber and the quality of timber that's on the site. And, despite all the hard work that we've done putting in this, particularly Rosanna, ultimately, when you get to a woodland, you can identify something which might really have quite a big impact on, the value to the woodland owner. If there's a private access which involves a bridge over a river which needs rebuilding, that can have a big impact on its value, and these sorts of things. If it's a relatively small woodland, so yeah. But having said that, there are also now satellite technologies being developed, from which you would be able to assess the volume of wood in a woodland. And I suspect once we've got that, we would then be able to do, to address what you're sort of talking about there. So. And largely existing woodland management, yes, it does include that already. So if there's an existing woodland management plan, if it's an approved woodland management plan, then it will be counted as managed woodland. If it isn't an approved woodland management plan, i.e. if it's just something which somebody has and they haven't registered it with the Forestry Commission, then no, it won't necessarily be picked up. So.
Great, thank you.
So thanks, Mark.
Rosanna, I don't know if you want to add anything to what Martin said about the applicability of the exercise you've done to woodland creation sites. I suppose it's possible, isn't it?
Yeah, I think Martin touched on it in the fact that there are people in various shapes and forms doing analysis, maybe not quite along the same lines, or in some cases along the same lines, to identify areas that I suppose both have low barriers for woodland creation, but also potentially have the best or the most benefits from creating woodland in that area. I know that there's a few online platforms at the moment that are developing those, but what is really interesting to note is that it's a tool to assisting woodland creation. Just because the online analysis says that this could be a great area, often there will be other factors that potentially haven't been included in the analysis. So there's, ground truthing should always happen, no matter kind of what the analysis shows. But there definitely is work going on. I think it's definitely a watch this space kind of area. There's lots of exciting conversations happening about it. And as Martin talked about with the kind of the radar and scanning to kind of give more details on both woodlands that exist already, but also land and just data on, I suppose, different aspects of that land that could be born to either management or have woodland created on it.
Thanks, Rosanna. It's just maybe useful to add, Mark, to that the Forestry Commission has done a bit of work on identifying low risk areas for woodland creation, and that sort of data set's ready available on their browser website. Again, we'll provide links to that in the presentations once we make those available. But as Rosanna said, it's ground truthing's the key here. I know from experience that particularly local historic environmental records aren't made publicly available, and you can only find that out for individual site searches and or actually looking at the site. Does it have ridge and furrow? Are there other evidence of earthworks there that would therefore say, should we be looking into historic environmental records in a bit more detail? But yeah, it's a good question to ask. I think more and more of what we do will go this way. Hopefully it should simplify our jobs a little bit as well, if this data is made more easily available up front. Because particularly woodland creation schemes can be very lengthy in terms of getting permission, whether that's permission to through environmental impact assessment, through habitat regulations, through applying for grants. It can be a very lengthy process, and if all this information is provided up front, clearly and easily accessible, it can make things a lot easier. Yeah. Right, moving on. Mark Shipperley, you've got a question about coppice management. Mark, I don't know if you want to ask your question for us.
Yeah, I was just sort of flagging up because I work with various coppice groups, and I'm just aware that often we don't have management plans because we're cutting below the quota of the timber that's a large enough size. So I'm just wondering whether there's a data set that should be got together, maybe from the Small Woodlands Association and the National Coppice Federation and the Association of Pole Lathe Turners and Green Woodworkers. Because for me, certainly up in Northumberland area, that seems to be a whole area of management where it's actively happening. And it may not be taking out the standards as timber, but it's certainly keeping the ground floor and that situation alive. And I wonder if that's actually being missed, maybe.
Fantastic question, Mark. Thank you. I think I'm getting a bit of echo on my microphone at the moment, so apologies for that. If it gets bad, Martin, let me know. Yeah. I think that's an excellent question, Mark, and an excellent suggestion. I'm a firm believer in coppice as a very useful management tool in woodlands, and yes, we should be identifying areas of coppice woodlands that fall under the radar, that don't require a felon license or don't require a management plan. As you say, coppice is one of those processes that falls under often falls under felon license requirements. It may be that we can have a conversation outside of this about how we take that forward. It's a great suggestion. I don't know if Martin or Rosanna have got anything to add to that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely right, Mark. And the answer is at the moment, no, we're not taking it into account really, anything other than the woodland management data set which the Forestry Commission provides. So if if a woodland is being coppiced, but as Will said, it for various reasons it doesn't come in on that, then no, we don't recognise it. We are having a few sort of discussions on the side with people like the White Rose Forest and the Woodland Trust, etc., about some of the clusters. So we may pick up on a few of them through that way. But generally speaking, I think the answer to the question is no, we're probably not picking those things up. And yes, as Will said, we do need to. I think we're quite aware that the despite all the the work that Rosanna just described, that probably the weak point in this in this system is the original data set of managed woodlands from the Forestry Commission, because the actual way in which that is worked out is really quite blunt, and there will be a number of woodlands which aren't managed, which according to that data set are, simply because there's a grant scheme in place. And then conversely, there will be woodlands which appear to be unmanaged but actually are, for the reasons you just outlined, Mark. So yeah, I think we accept that the very thing that it's based on is quite blunt in a way, and there probably needs to refine that. But the Forestry Commission are aware of that and hoping to work on it anyway. But it's a start. I think that's all we can say. So, Mark,
I'll contact you outside of the meeting if that's okay. Take that forward.
Yeah, that's fine, Will. Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, moving on. Couple more questions come in. CG, I think you want us to ask this for you, just about how far funds might go in management in New Woodland and overstood coppice. Difficult one. I mean, bringing woods back into management can be a bit of a money pit, depending how far you want to go with reinstating that management. But really, you should always look to offset your costs with any value in the timber or products that are coming out, of course. And then also are additional funds available to you. For example, we've mentioned them previously, countryside stewardship funds that might also help offset costs in your wood. Modest sums obviously wouldn't go very far. I mean, it depends what you mean about that particular amount and what you'd use it for. How big your woodland is. So yeah, maybe 300 per hectare. Yes, sorry, beg your pardon. Okay, so that's new management, ongoing management, annual maintenance fund, I think they call it, under countryside stewardship. Basically, your upfront costs are key in creating new woodlands, and the new revised rates under countryside stewardship, it's called England Woodland Creation Offer, are pretty good. I mean, speaking to people who supply trees and plant them, they're saying those rates are good, and that would cover the majority of upfront costs in most cases, and therefore that follow-on maintenance of £300 per hectare again should be covering adequately your ongoing maintenance costs in your woodland. Bearing in mind that your key requirements are to plant the number of trees that you said you were going to plant in your original contract, so that's what you've always got to bear in mind, and focusing that maintenance funding on achieving that. So if you say you're going to plant 1,600 trees to the hectare, when they come out and look at your scheme in 5-10 years time, they'll count the trees. Have you got 1,600 trees to the hectare? So that's what you'll be spending your money on. Your main costs will be things like weed control, replacing dead trees, and ongoing, particularly if you're using tubes and stakes, is ongoing tube straightening, particularly after periods of high wind. And then obviously if you're not using tubes and you're relying on fencing, in particular deer fencing, is keeping that fencing secure and sound, from livestock and or deer. So those are your costs really. But yeah, the new rates under UCO are pretty good. Having spoke to people in this industry, they certainly are looking at meeting the actual costs of schemes. Hope that's answered that one. Rosanna, I might pick on you on the next question that CG has asked, the online woodland mapping, which sites allow the individual manager to see the data, but not everyone else. I'm guessing this is a privacy issue. This would be about narrowing down the data to specific sites, I'm guessing.
Yeah, perhaps. And I mean, if CG wants to know what the score that we've generated is for that particular pocket of woodland in the northeast, then I'm sure we can take this offline. I interpreted the question slightly differently though, Will. I wondered whether it was kind of referencing my forest.
Okay. Yeah,
And
that's how I interpret it as well. Yeah.
Okay,
So
apologies.
I don't know whether someone else wants to talk a bit more about My Forest, or whether we'd recommend to CG to turn up next week and allow George to talk about the tool itself, rather than hearing it kind of third hand through us. But Martin, I don't know whether you want to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, yes, you're quite right. I think, Rosanna, that's how I interpret it. And the honest answer, I don't know. I think with My Forest that the information isn't made available to everybody unless you sort of declare that option, if you like. But yeah, you know, I would say just either query that direct to the Silver Foundation or come along next week and hear more about it. There are, you know, My Forest is just one, you know, it is probably the only online platform, but there are, you know, other templates that are available, for example, provided by the Forestry Commission to do a text document, which you can do and submit to the Forestry Commission. And in those instances, the information, the detailed information isn't made available, so isn't made publicly available. So.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for that. Sorry about my misinterpretation of the question there. I'm glad there's others on the call to sort it out. Next one, A&M Parker, would you like to ask your question, or would you like us to do it for you?
Right. Thank you. It's Alan Parker here, Will.
Thank you, Alan.
It's not really a question, it's a statement. We have a small woodland not far from where we live. Oh, I lost this one, sorry.
Yeah,
and we manage it on a personal basis. We've actually got a management plan drawn up with the help of My Forest, but we've never actually applied for a grant. So it seems, unfortunately, it counts as unmanaged in the wider scheme of things. I think, I don't know how you get around it, but I think there may be quite a few others like this. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Martin, can I?
Yeah, you're quite right, Alan. You know, as I said, that's the weakness in the original data set. That unless you do have some sort of grant scheme or an approved woodland management plan on it, then it shows up as unmanaged. I think what I would say is that the numbers of those that applies to woodlands, I suspect probably isn't high, and the areas are probably relatively small, simply because if you're producing, you know, that over 5 cubic inches timber a quarter, then you've got to have a felling license on it, for example. So, but yes, you're quite right. You know, in that situation, it will show as unmanaged, and that is a weakness in the system. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. I think, Alan, you have the option, if you've done a small woodland management plan, particularly using the My Forest tool, of picking that into the Forestry Commission and say, please, can you approve this and grant a felling license as such, and therefore that would then register on their system.
Yeah, but I'm not actually looking to fell anything at the moment.
Okay, right, fine. Yeah. Okay, understood.
That's not part of the management plan. Has said we are not looking to fell.
Yeah, understood. Yeah.
Well, you're looking to improve biodiversity and all the rest, but not actually fell.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, understood.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks for that.
Another example, just briefly, another example of where that would apply is, you know, any sort of woodland which is established, and in that period after establishment, before first thinning, for example, where often no management is needed and there's no grant scheme on it, it will show on the data set as being unmanaged. So most woodlands are sort of between about 10 and say 25 years will show as being unmanaged. But you know, ultimately that's another way in which you know, online systems can help, because we could probably quickly rule that out with just looking at you know, online photographs and working that out. So.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, so just continuing on, Andy has a question which he's asked that we ask for him. Yes, producing approved woodland management plans is a complex process. You've obviously got experience, and then using that to access additional funding. You've obviously been through the pain before, Andy, I can tell. Could the process be simplified? I would like it to be simplified also as a forest manager, doing that kind of activity, particularly going on to CS higher tier applications. It is a pretty involving process. I guess it's for the Forestry Commission and their colleagues at Natural England to answer that one. Yeah, if there was a lobby group formed asking for simplifying the processes, I'd certainly join it. I don't know if you've got any thoughts yourself, but yeah, it would be nice. Maybe this tool could help that. I don't know. Maybe we could look at how could this be applied. I mean, we've used, haven't we, access to countryside stewardship funds as one of the testing criteria in our tool. So yeah, maybe there's something there. I don't know, Martin or Rosanna, you've got anything to add to that?
Not really, no. I think, you know, clearly the fewer barriers there are, the better, and certainly woodland management planning can be as you quite rightly say, Andy, can be a very time-consuming process. So, yeah.
Okay. Right. I don't know if anybody's would like to ask anything else.
I would, Will,
yeah,
if there's
please,
time, if there aren't any other questions. I just wondered what everyone's thoughts on the call were on what the most important factors are when bringing woodlands into management. You know, we've obviously spent a few weeks now talking about why this should be brought into management, and we went through a lengthy discussion process about what is the most important. Is it the woodland side? Is it access to roads? Is it biodiversity? I just wondered whether anyone on the call had their own views on it they wanted to share.
That's good question, Rosanna. Yeah. Perhaps if people, you know, either don't have time now or you could always just drop us a quick email, or maybe this got me thinking now, Rosanna. Maybe we'll even pop out a quick survey to people. Everybody who's attended a webinar, we'll send them a quick survey and ask them that very question.
No,
Nick's mentioned funding.
Yeah, thanks, Nick.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I can certainly see that being quite key from a farming perspective, fencing, gates, etc. Yeah, for sure. And then access to OKCG, you come back with a comment about access to working with the right people. Yeah. I know, Martin, you've done quite a lot of work at the moment on that side of the sector, haven't you? Skills training, etc.
Yeah, doing some work at the moment with people in Cumbria around it, and it's, you know, it is a real issue for everybody getting the right people with the right skills and what have you to do the work. It seems ironic that there's huge demand for this and there's people wanting to do it, but linking the two up is a problem. So yeah.
There's also the amenity value to communities. I don't know if you include that in your criteria.
We have.
Yeah.
Sorry, Rosanna. I'll go on.
Yeah, we did include people as a category, and then it was kind of, obviously it's a geographic analysis. It was trying to identify a data set that would and could represent that in the analysis. So I think we went for, Martin, you can provide more detail, I'm sure, on the Forestry Commission's data set about improving access to certain types of areas. And so we use that to include that on the benefits side to show that, you know, if those unmanaged woodlands were brought into management, they might provide benefits to people.
Yes, as Rosanna said, the Forestry Commission do provide some data sets around, you know, where, for example, new woodland would be best situated, which relates to the amount of existing woodland with access compared to the numbers of people. There's also something called the multiple index and multiple deprivation, which again the Forestry Commission use in some of their work, and that again is something that we looked at using. So yes, I think it would. I think that's one of those things that's very site specific in many ways, and very specific also to the local community, of course, concerned. So, but yeah, I think again it's something that's, you know, very important. So and has been emphasised over the last couple of years or so, clearly. So.
I think, Nick, to pick up on your comment, we have spoken to White Rose Forest about the stuff and the analysis that they're doing and the engagement that they're doing, and it was through those conversations with other people that we kind of included that people aspect, because it is very important to bear in mind.
It's interesting, those social benefits, working with other users of woodlands, whether they be schools or local people, via, you know, public rights of way, whatever it might be. It's sort of re-engaging culturally with woodlands. Something that the guys at Silver have been doing a lot on, trying to create, I think what they phrase as a wood culture, isn't it, Martin? I think that's what they're trying to develop. But we've definitely seen a big growth in interest in things like forest schools, and I know my kids have been on them previously quite a few times and loved it. It's a great way of you know, bringing, you know, young people and engaging with them in that sort of woodland environment.
There's also this concept of natural capital, and I don't know whether a managed woodland is seen to have more natural capital than an unmanaged one.
It's a good question, Mark. There was some research done a year or two ago about that, actually. I think it was focused on a plantation forest, and it looked at values such as carbon, you know, timber production, you know, how a large plantation forest can, you know, affect runoff and into water courses, and therefore reduce flooding incidences. All those things were looked at in terms of the value of the natural capital, and you can put numbers on carbon, timber, etc. But what they struggled to put numbers on were things like biodiversity. You know, okay, a plantation forest isn't necessarily going to provide the greatest you know, amount of biodiversity, but it may be an improvement on what was there before. What's the value of that? I think they struggled with that. But I think as time goes on, we'll get to understand that a bit better. Natural capital values of woodland, putting numbers on that. Right, we are almost at 6 o'clock. I don't know if anybody's got any last thoughts or comments they'd like to put forward. Nothing pinging in on the chat. Okay, well, look, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Hopefully you can join us for the My Forest presentation, George's My Forest presentation next week. And as we've said, we will be making the presentations available as PDFs. We just haven't worked out the best way in which we can share those with you, but we will be emailing out to everybody in due course about that. So hopefully we'll see you next week.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.